I don't know if Kevin's back yet. If Kevin is not there, oh, I gotta let, I have to, bunch of people I still need to admit, including Kevin.
Here it comes.
I think we're there. Are you in now, Kevin?
I am back, and there's no reverb. We're good, right?
Yeah, I think we're good. I think that was the reason for the reverb. I did ask everybody to mute their microphone. And, you know, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, Kevin's not here. But I think everybody is admitted, and I'll continue to watch that. We are asking people to put in where they're from in the chat box, which is down in the bottom middle on most Zooms. Some people, depending what device you're on, it might be at the top. But just put that in and let us know if you're a member of PERT or Audubon or neither. That's okay too. But with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Kevin, our program chair, and he is also the educational director at the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust.
Awesome. Thank you, Lee. I appreciate the introduction. So I think Lee already went through the recording. Everybody knows we're recording.
Yes.
You already said everybody should stay on mute and keep your video off as well. That helps the program go a lot smoother. So if you could turn your mic and your video off until we're done the presentation, that would be appreciated. So if you have your video on, everybody but Lee or Les should have their video off. Perfect. Okay. So welcome to the Wyncote Audubon Society's monthly program, and it's a joint program, like Lee said, with the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust. Thanks for joining us on your Friday night. And tonight we have Dr. Les Murray. Dr. Murray is an associate professor of biology at Penn State Abington, and he has been there since 2009 teaching animal behavior, evolution, introductory biology, and the biological impacts of climate change. He completed a PhD in wildlife ecology at the University of Wisconsin and a master's in animal ecology from Iowa State University after he earned an undergraduate degree in biology from Ithaca College. Dr. Murray has studied how management practices and vegetation composition and structure influence habitat use by birds in the grasslands of the Midwest and meadows and forests in Pennsylvania. Tonight, he will discuss the results of his research project assessing bird abundance relative to vegetation characteristics in forested areas in the Pennypack Ecological Restoration Trust. So with a particular focus on native and non-native shrubs. So all of you here tonight to hear that from Dr. Les Murray, and I have nothing else to say. I'll pass it on to Dr. Les Murray.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Lee. So as we go forward here, just to let people know, if you have questions, I do this about 9 hours a week, giving talks and having people ask questions. So if you have questions, you can raise your virtual hand in Zoom using the usually it's a if there's a reaction button available. I'm not sure if it's available in this version, or put a question in the chat, and I've gotten pretty good at keeping track of the chat as I go along. So I can take questions that way as well. And then of course, questions at the end also. So I threw you a little curveball, Kevin. I decided at the last minute that I was going to talk a little bit about some of the grassland stuff that I've done at Pennypack as well, and kind of give a full picture of kind of this idea of native versus non-native plants when it comes to habitat for birds. So we will get a little bonus coverage of some of the grassland stuff that we've done as well. So I started working at Pennypack, or at least thinking about doing research at Pennypack when I first got here in 2009. And I think David Robertson, who just joined, is probably the first person that I contacted when I started thinking about how I was going to move my research from the Midwest to Pennsylvania. So it was good to see David join us here. So what I'm going to kind of start with is the idea that that most of us know, right? That's why we're here, is that many populations of birds are declining. If you look at percentage change of bird populations in basically all habitats, we can see these declines in populations. And so here the light purple line is the eastern forest and the green line is the grassland. And you can see that since the 60s, that populations in those two habitats in general have been declining. So that's what brings a lot of this work about, is thinking about how do we help populations of birds to either stop that decline or even help them to increase in abundance, as the environment continues to change and their habitats continue to change. And so a couple of the species that I'm going to talk about specifically tonight, one of them is the eastern meadowlark. So this is a species that we find in grasslands in Pennsylvania. And this map is from the Breeding Bird Survey data that shows in most of the range for the eastern meadowlark, their populations are declining, and declining at least 1.5% per year. So a fairly steady decline in the eastern meadowlark populations. And we can see the same thing for another focal species, at least in the eastern part of its population, the wood thrush, where again we see these declines, with the reds and the orange demonstrating declines in populations. We do see some increases in populations of wood thrush in the Midwest in some places, however. So, but both of these species are species of concern from a management standpoint, that we need to think about kind of what the habitats are that they rely on, and within those habitats, what are some of the key features that they rely on in order for that habitat to really help them to maintain a population. And so, as probably all of us in here know, the major reason that we see declines in populations of birds is associated with loss of habitat, fragmentation of that habitat, and degradation of habitat. And so here, a couple of pictures that show some of this loss of grassland habitat, and fragmentation of habitat. And of course, we can see the same thing if we were to look at forest, right? Small patches of forested habitat do not support as many species or as large of populations as large forest fragments. And those birds that are in those forest fragments are going to be impacted by what surrounds those forest fragments, whether we have agriculture or housing or some other type of land use. And so a lot of my research focuses on this idea of what habitat is available, how much habitat is available, and what does the surrounding habitat look like, and how does that impact the abundance of these species. And so the Pennypack Trust was a great place, being at Penn State Abington, for me to kind of begin to think about these questions, in that their major goal is to help maintain some of these natural areas and these habitats that can be used by birds and preserve them, right? So I think up to about 852 acres now, I think, if that's the most recent estimate, I think, Kevin, of habitat.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so in an area that is surrounded by, as you can see from this picture, not so great habitat, right? A lot of housing and development surrounding that area. So the preservation of this 800 plus acres is really an oasis, if you will, for a lot of the species that rely on this habitat in this area of southeastern Pennsylvania. And so my focus then became, well, what types of birds are using this habitat, and what characteristics of that habitat are they keying in on? And so again, in the Pennypack Trust, we have lots of protected forest, right? So areas of forest that are in easements and protected, that will be there for a long time. And so this provides a great stable location for habitat for many breeding birds, which is what we're going to focus on today. And I apologize, I don't have, I realize this every time I do a research project. I don't have a lot of pictures because usually when I'm out there, I'm so focused on collecting data that I forget to stop and take pictures. So I don't have as many pictures of some of the great locations in the trust that I'd like to have. But I'm always so focused in getting my work done that I forget to stop and take some pictures. In here is a restored grassland at the trust. And so a fairly expansive area of restored grassland that can be used as habitat for grassland birds. So a completely different set of species than we would see in those protected forested areas. And so it gave me the opportunity to look at both these groups of species in one area and see how they're responding to these different protective measures and restoration measures. So the objective of the study then was to examine the relationship between bird abundance and vegetation characteristics in meadows, and then in the second study in forests, with a focus on is there a difference between native and non-native vegetation? So in areas where you have native grasses, how does that impact which bird species we see in their abundance versus non-native grasses? And within the forest, I'm going to focus on native versus non-native shrubs. So for the most part, the trees that we're going to find on the trust are going to be all native species of trees. So that's not really impacting the forest and the birds in the forest too much, but the vegetation under those trees in the shrub layer, you'll know that there's many non-native shrubs that can kind of come in and change the habitat in there. So we're going to look at both of those questions. What's the difference between native and non-native grasses? And then how does some of these native shrubs play a role in bird abundance? And so the idea of native versus non-native grasses is not something new. People have studied this before, and we'll see some kind of conclusions from that. But there's reasons to focus on native vegetation, and many benefits to that outside of providing bird habitat. And so, but they do provide different structures of habitat for the birds. As you can see in this picture, kind of tall, thick vegetation and grass on the left versus generally shorter and a little bit sparser non-native vegetation on the right. And so we can ask the question, how does this impact the bird populations? And so some of the benefits of these native plantings is that generally native plantings tend to do a better job of erosion control with deep root systems. And so if we look at the species of plants of grass on here, right, the native species are the things like the blue stems, which have these deep root systems, which are really good for controlling erosion, compared to our non-native species like the smooth brome or the Kentucky bluegrass that have much shorter root systems and therefore are not as good at in erosion control and starting to help form a good soil layer. So that's one of the benefits, is these stronger, deeper root systems that we generally get from these native plantings. And then also native plants tend to attract native biodiversity, such as insects and butterflies. And so the benefits of these native plantings from a restoration standpoint, from a grassland restoration standpoint, are also very well documented and provide a lot of habitat structure for biodiversity in these areas. But when we look at grassland bird abundance, and as I mentioned before, this is something that's been well studied in the Midwest and other parts of the East, is that generally where you find birds, the grassland birds, and how abundant they are is determined by the structure of the habitat rather than which species is there. So whether it's a native or a non-native species. And so this figure on the bottom is one that James Herkert produced. I believe it was in 93. That summarized this idea of how important vegetation structure is for grassland birds. And so it has vegetation density on the left and vegetation height on the x-axis here. And so, right, killdeer, which we might not think of necessarily as a grassland bird, but really they're in grassland areas with very short and sparse vegetation, compared to things like sedge wrens, which you're going to find in really tall and dense vegetation. And then we have some of our prairie birds that we generally think of, grassland birds that we generally think of, like the meadowlarks, that are kind of in between, kind of in the middle of this. And so we know going in that generally where we're going to find different species of grassland birds and how abundant they are going to be is going to be largely determined by the physical structure of the vegetation rather than non-native versus native species. And so the question then becomes is, well, what types of habitat structure do non-native grasses present, and what type of habitat structure do native grasses present? And so oftentimes when we have native restored grassland plantings, they tend to be on the tall, dense side. And so we get a lot of things like common yellow-throats, red-winged blackbirds. Well, our non-native plantings tend to be sparser and less dense, or less lower in stature. And so we may expect to see some different species moving in there. And so when I began to think about research projects that I could get going once I got to Penn State Abington, after having worked on grassland birds for the last 5 or 10 years prior to that, I really wanted to continue that as much as I could, just to kind of keep my momentum going. And so I devised a study to look at how grassland birds in the Northeast are using habitats, and if those habitat structures that we see in the Midwest that determine their abundance and their habitat use carry over to the East. And so I identified 44 different restored meadows, including some at Pennypack, but also some at other land trusts, or within about 45 minutes or so of Pennypack. And one of the biggest sites, as you see here in this picture, was Valley Forge. And these red dots on here represent different locations where I surveyed birds to estimate their abundance, and then also measured the vegetation to compare the vegetation to that bird abundance. And so all of the points were at least 250 meters apart, 50 meters from a grassland edge, because we know that along the edge you get a different set of bird species and things change. So I wanted to avoid any effects of the edge as much as possible. And so I surveyed birds in these meadows for 2 years, from 2011 to 2012. And then also measured vegetation to go along with this. So these are 2 students that helped me with this field work in one of the years here. And so on the left, you can see they're measuring vegetation height and vegetation density. And this is at Valley Forge. And then on the right here, this is a frame that we use to give us a standard area where we could estimate what percentage of the ground cover was different types of vegetation from different types of forbs and grasses. And so we actually did our best to estimate those percentages for each species that made up at least 5% of the frame. And so we estimated then how much of the vegetation is native versus non-native based off of that sampling. And so we took those samples around the survey points so that we could relate abundance directly to those vegetation measurements. And I did a similar thing in the forest starting in 2014. Where I was interested in what characteristics are determining where we see different forest birds at Pennypack. And so I randomly generated 74 sampling points in forested areas at the trust that were at least 200 meters apart and 50 meters from the edge for the same reason. And I surveyed those in 2014 and 2015 as well. I took a lot of the same vegetation measurements that we saw in the grassland, looking at kind of the height of the shrubs. As well, I estimated the size of the trees in the area, how tall the canopy was, how close the forest canopy was as well. I'm not going to present all of that information today. I'm going to focus on the shrub layer for today, but we do have information as far as what type of forest it is, what type of trees were there as well that we can relate to this abundance. And so within the forested areas, I'm going to focus mainly on one native shrub, the spice bush. And the reason I focus on that is because it was by far the most abundant and common native shrub that in these areas. And so it became pretty obvious early on that this was a species that I needed to focus my attention on was the spice bush. As far as the non-native species of shrubs that we see in these areas, multiflora rose is one of the most abundant. There was also some honeysuckles mixed in there as well. But really, we can see the comparison of the difference between these two species, other than being native and non-native as well. The multiflora rose creates this thick bramble of vegetation that's has very low visibility from a bird's perspective, is hard to move through from a researcher's perspective. A couple of my survey points, I had to get down on the ground and crawl under the multiflora rose in order to get to my survey point. So there was a couple of survey points when I finished doing that last survey in that second year. I was celebrating not having to try to get back to that point again. Where in the spice bush, generally a more open area, easier to walk through, and provides quite a bit different habitat for birds. So that's what I'm going to focus on here with the forest birds. And so in both of these studies, for each of those survey points, twice a year, I would travel to those points and conduct a 10-minute point count of the birds that I saw or heard in that area. And then using that information, I can compare it to those vegetation measurements to look at the relationship between abundance and the different vegetation characteristics. So in the grassland areas, we found some relationships that we expected to see here. Common yellowthroats and red-winged blackbirds were positively related to taller and denser vegetation, which typically were native grasses. So things like switchgrass, blue stem, for example, those types of areas tended to attract more common yellowthroats and red-winged blackbirds than areas with shorter grasses. But we also had some species that seemed to show a positive relationship to areas that were dominated by non-native grasses. So both bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks, probably of the grassland birds in the east, two of the species of most conservation concern, seem to be positively related to these non-native grasses and negatively related to vegetation density and height. which again is kind of what we would expect based off of what we know about these two species. And so so this starts to then ask questions about how do we approach grassland restoration if two of the species we're concerned about seem to be more attractive to non-native grasses versus native grasses. And so here we can see the data for the 6 species that were most common that we could potentially classify as grassland birds. Eastern meadowlarks, bobolinks definitely fit into that grassland category, red-winged blackbirds, and common yellowthroats kind of on the edge of that, especially common yellowthroats. They can be found in so many places. And then we have more of our kind of edgy field sparrows and song sparrows. But here we can see clearly higher abundance of bobolinks and meadowlarks in non-native grasses. The red-winged blackbirds, the data is we're showing a spike there as well, but there's so much variation that the relationship actually was for just taller vegetation in that habitat. So, but we can see clearly that some species are using the non-native habitats more than the native habitats. And when you have a mix, you're generally somewhere in between. And as I mentioned before, this idea of grassland birds using non-native grasses is not new. It's something that's been studied many times. And so some species we find really high abundance of that species in these non-native grasses. And there's some studies that show that species like the Henslow sparrow in the Midwest, maybe their populations may be being conserved through fields that were planted to smooth brome, a non-native grass, as part of the Conservation Reserve Program. When I was in Wisconsin doing roadside surveys for grassland birds, looking at how landscapes affect grassland bird abundance, almost all of our observations were in areas where the Henslow sparrows were using smooth brome Conservation Reserve Program fields. So that seemed to be the habitat that they were using, even though there were native prairie remnants and other native grass vegetation available in the area. However, the studies on nesting success have shown that there's, from a bird perspective, there's not really a difference as far as reproductive success between non-native and native grasslands. So again, from a restoration standpoint, we always want to think about native habitats, native species. Some of this data suggests that we may need to consider some non-native grasses in order to conserve these species. So I mentioned here the Henslow sparrow, which we see here, and this is the typical habitat that we would find the Henslow sparrow in Wisconsin. And so some of the species seem to benefit from these non-native grasses. But the question then we have to ask is, these are native species of birds. So obviously, historically, they were using native species of grasses. And so we can start to ask that question of, is there something we can do with native grasses to attract and provide habitat for these native species? And so there's a couple questions in the chat. One of them was the question about how non-native birds are impacted by native versus non-native plants. And I'm sure there's been some research done on this. It's not familiar to me at this time as far as kind of what the conclusion is. But I'm sure it's not a lot of research, just because generally there's not a lot of research done on non-native birds from a conservation habitat kind of standpoint of kind of what they like. But there's probably a little bit done on that. But for the most part, in these grassland areas, there's not a lot other than the occasional starlings that kind of make their way through, there's generally not a lot of non-native bird species in these areas that have made their way over there. So it's not a big area of study, especially for grassland birds. And then the second question was, is there a difference in insect abundance between native and non-native grasses? And people have looked at this in the Midwest, especially associated with Conservation Reserve Program. A lot of grassland bird studies in the Midwest were focused on that program because there was so much land being converted from agriculture into that program, especially in the 80s. So my master's advisor was one of the leading researchers on those types of questions. And people have studied that since. And generally what people find is that for grassland birds, it's really hard to find any relationship between food abundance in different types of grassland and nesting success and abundance, just because they use so many different types of insects. They're not really specialists on any one food source. So they use so many different species of insects that generally there's something there for them to feed on. And so most studies on grassland birds and food use have not found any real results that suggest that there's a huge difference in food that explains the habitat use patterns. And so another question in the chat about the idea that caterpillars are required for nestlings, and which means that you need native plants to attract the butterflies and the moths. And so a couple of points to that is, one, yes. I mean, most of the time the nestlings are being fed some form of larvae, whether they're depends on the species, whether they're caterpillars or just some other form of insect larvae. And so there are other forms of larvae that are going to be available, and the birds are good at finding that. So it doesn't require just caterpillars, or only caterpillars to feed the nestlings. And the other point to that is that in many of these non-native grasslands, there are areas close enough by with some native forbs, and that's something that most of these bird species require, is some form of non-grass vegetation that the caterpillars are attracted to, or excuse me, that the butterflies are attracted to, that they would lay their eggs and the caterpillars would be on. And so in most of these grasses, you have that mix, right? If you had just 100%, just one species of grass, whether it be native or non-native, there's not generally going to be a lot of larvae available. And so diversity in the structure is important. If you watch these birds forage, I spent a lot of time at Valley Forge watching the meadowlarks forage. There's definitely areas that they forage in more often than others, and it depends on what plants are available. So one thing that's always important to grassland birds is a mix of having those non-grass, those forb vegetation in there as well. So even for the meadowlarks and the bobolinks, having that there, because that's generally where they're going to find the larvae, is living on those plants. One more question in the chat. The studies on nest success would be our best way to kind of look at reproductive success, or the way that's used most often. And generally we find that there's, between native and non-native grasses, there's not really a difference in production of young from the nest. And we also find that generally for most grassland bird species, predation is what's driving nest success and whether they successfully reproduce, rather than food limitations. And so again, most of the studies that look at grassland bird food use don't find any evidence of food limitations in most of these grasslands. Now, that could be that the birds are not breeding in the habitats where food is not available, right? They can get more complex than just a simple everything's okay. but generally the patterns that we found have not suggested that a lack of food is what's driving low nest success or population declines, but more just generally loss of habitat, especially from the 1960s on, which is what our breeding bird survey data show. If we think about agriculture in the 50s and the 60s, there was a lot more pasture, a lot more hay production compared to row crops. And so as agriculture kind of switched to those row crops, we lost a lot of grassland habitat in the Midwest and in the East. So that's so that becomes an important idea as well. And so Chris puts a question in the chat about encroachment on grasslands, which is always a big issue with grasslands, is because that's a natural occurrence, right? Is he's specifically pointing out some invasive species, which and that's one thing I should mention about these non-native grasses. This is that generally they're not really considered invasive. In that they don't really spread. Most of these non-native grasses that we're talking about are things that are being planted, but they're not generally invading and completely taking over. So the ones that are valuable, such as the smooth brome, generally are areas that have been planted versus an invasive invasion of those species. But just the encroachment into grasslands from shrubby species and things like briars and porcelain berry and other woody vegetation are a natural occurrence in grasslands. And so that's why fire has always been a key component in grassland ecosystems, especially in the Midwest. That's why fire's always considered a good management tool for grasslands because it's a natural disturbance that kind of keeps back that encroachment and keeps a grassland a grassland. Most grasslands without some kind of disturbance would succeed would go through succession into a shrubby type habitat and eventually probably a woodland type habitat. And so the disturbance in the fire, which kills the woody vegetation and the shrubs, but doesn't kill the roots of the grass, so the grass can grow back the next year. So that crowding from exotic invasive species or just shrubs in general is always a concern. And usually from a grassland management standpoint, fire is the best way to do that, because you can maintain the natural grassland habitat through the fire. Obviously burning porcelain berry in a forest isn't going to work as well. So if our goal from a restoration standpoint is to restore native habitats, right? But we're saying that birds are using non-native species of grass. The question that I like to ask is there a way we can manage native grasses to increase the benefit to birds? And by changing things such as seeding density, right? So maybe a lot of times when we restore grasslands to native grasses, we seed them at really high densities to make sure that restoration is successful. And then we get these really dense patches of grasses that are not attractive to some species of birds. We also oftentimes in those restorations will use a lot of fertilizer or increase the soil nutrients, which creates almost a monoculture of some of these species of grass that may, again, create structure that's not amenable to some of the species of birds. So maybe we can use different planting mixes to provide some of that variation in habitat. And this is being used in some of the restorations in this area now. So it's something that's being investigated to look at how the planting a mix of grasses can provide more variation in the habitat structure that can therefore provide habitat for more species of birds. And then Chris Norbent, who was at the SUNY Brockport and had studied grassland birds in the East, has suggested using native cool season grasses. And what we mean here by cool season grasses are grasses that grow early in the season. So March, April, May. Then kind of stop growing in the warmer months of the summer, so you don't get that tall, dense vegetation, and then grow again a little bit more in the fall. So they're more associated with kind of the spring and early fall as far as their periods of growth. They generally don't grow as tall in stature as some of our warm season grasses that are going to grow during the warmer summer months. And generally are taller and have denser vegetation. So he suggested using some of these native cool season grasses that would have a growth form more similar to things like smooth brome in order to introduce native species and still provide the habitat structure for the birds. And so these are just some suggestions, some things that people are trying to manipulate to see if you can change that habitat structure. Now, of course, going along with this, we have concerns about making sure we limit invasive species and the possibility of invasive species coming into these restorations, which is one of the reasons that we plant at a really high seeding density. So there are always other concerns other than just bird habitat that need to be taken into consideration. The other thing we can do is try and manage these grassland habitats for habitat structures that are beneficial to birds. And so this is actually a picture from my master's work in Iowa, where we were looking at how harvesting switchgrass for use as a biofuel was potentially impact bird populations. And so here we have one of the fields where we harvested part of the field, as you see on the right of the picture, and then left the left side of that of this part of the field unharvested. And so you can see on the left side, there's all of this residual vegetation from the previous growing season. And Tim's here is about 6 feet tall, so you can see that's a really tall residual vegetation. Where on the right, all of that's been removed through the harvesting, and we're left with kind of young, kind of sparse growing grass without that residual vegetation. And we saw a huge difference between areas of fields and fields that were harvested versus those that were not. The fields that were not harvested, we had lots of red-winged blackbirds, lots of common yellowthroats. The common yellowthroats absolutely loved nesting in that residual vegetation. There were so many yellowthroats nesting in there that I was able to write a whole paper just about yellowthroat nesting habitat. And the harvested areas, we saw things like grasshopper sparrows, which are species that really do prefer very short, sparse grasses, generally areas that have recently been burned, or pastures that are grazed provide habitat for that. And so things like mowing and grazing can change the habitat structure to target certain species of birds. You can use fire to do the same thing. And sometimes it just takes time, where over time, the vegetation starts to not be as dense, and we get more variety in there. We get some more forbs in there. We get maybe a few other species of grass over time as some succession occurs that may change the habitat a little bit. So Kevin, the switchgrass was harvested in the fall / winter, which was quite the ordeal, but it was harvested at a time where it wouldn't, where they could get as much biomass as they could from the field without impacting the birds. So again, most of the growth of this species of grass is going to be in the summer. So by the end of the summer, say July, by the time we left, when we were kind of done looking at the breeding birds, the grass in many of these areas were 6-7 foot tall, where you could be standing next to somebody. I had one student that was working with me that was like 6'4", and I could be 3 feet away from him and not be able to see him by the end of the summer. And so they really didn't want to harvest it until the fall. So it did avoid the breeding season as well. But in this case, right, harvesting it provided habitat for some species of concern, but it did remove habitat compared to these idle grasslands. And all of these were fields, again, in that conservation reserve program that provided habitat, not just for red-winged blackbirds and common yellowthroats, but we found 5 northern harrier nests in the unharvested areas as well as some other species. We found a turkey nest in one of them one time that had a heart attack when I flushed that off the nest. So providing both structures or both types of habitat provided more habitat for more bird species. But we can use these types of management techniques potentially to try to get habitat from native grass species that provide habitat for native birds. So moving on to the forest results. Again, focus just on the shrub cover, because there's so many things that could impact bird abundance in a forest, right? The types of trees, the height of the trees, the landscape surrounding them. And again, I have that information. I'm a little bit behind in my analyses to work out all of those. But if we look just at the shrubs, there are definitely species that we would expect that their abundance and the probability of detecting these birds is greatly influenced by how much shrub cover there is in that area of the forest. And so the gray catbird obviously is one of those, right? This is a species that we know nests in shrubs and prefers this type of shrubby habitat. And we can see a clear relationship here where about 22%, 23% of the variation in their abundance is explained just by how much shrub coverage there is in the forest. And we see the same thing with the wood thrush, not as strong of a relationship as we saw, but a statistically significant relationship where more shrub cover means more wood thrushes, right? And so this is, again, information that we kind of knew going in, right? If you were going to go look for a wood thrush, you would go to forested areas that have some shrub cover, at least in the breeding season when they're using those shrubs to breed in. But then what I did is I broke it down and said, okay, well, our native shrub is the spice bush. So are there species that are using the spice bush that are relying on this native species that would argue that we really need to strive for these native shrubs in these areas. And actually, this should be, I forgot to change the title of this slide. This should be negative relationship to spice bush for the song sparrow. Pretty strong one, as a matter of fact. We didn't have a lot of song sparrows in the forest. Again, they're kind of more edge species. But in areas where there was lots of spice bush, there were almost no song sparrows. And so they seem to be using different types of habitat. And I think that's what's driving this relationship, is that just the habitat where you typically find spice bush in more mature areas of the forest isn't necessarily the habitat that song sparrows are using. So I don't think that song sparrows are necessarily avoiding the spice bush. I think it's just in different types of habitats. But I threw it in here just to kind of show that sometimes there's a negative relationship. But again, I don't think it's a avoidance of spice bush. Now remember, the catbirds had this strong relationship to the amount of shrubs, but when we look just at the native shrubs, there's no relationship. So for the catbirds, it doesn't seem like the type of shrub or whether the shrub is native or non-native really is driving their abundance. It's just that shrubby component that they prefer, especially a really thick shrubby component. And if you're familiar with gray catbirds, they don't seem to mind multiflora rose, that non-native species, or honeysuckles as much. And so so this is, again, a relationship we expected to see. but when we look at the wood thrush, which is probably of the species that I observed in these forested areas on a regular basis, as far as the species that's there breeding at fairly good numbers in the on the trust property. It's a species of concern, and we see a very strong relationship to the number of spice bush stems and wood thrush abundance. And again, here about 36% of the variation in wood thrush abundance seems to be explained by spice bush. And this makes sense as this is a species that can provide food, and also a species that provides nesting habitat. So I did not look for nests during this study. So I don't have any numbers about that, but I do know that most of the breeding type behavior and what seemed like nesting behavior, I did find a couple of nests without really trying, seems to be that their breeding activity are focused on the spice bush. So it's providing breeding habitat at the appropriate height, which I think is important. Generally 5 to 10 feet off the ground. And the spice bush provides good structure for that. So, so here we see a clear benefit between the native shrub. And so, Bonnie, I agree with what you said in the chat. Right, the spice bush is maybe one of the reasons it was so abundant as a native species is because the deer don't eat it as much or at all. So where other native species maybe are being browsed by the deer more. So it may be that the wood thrush are relying on these spice bush for that reason. Again, maybe not so much that it's just a species that they require as so much as that it is the species that is available that provides the requirements, and that other species of shrub may provide those requirements. And the catbirds definitely like dense shrub cover that the spice bush doesn't provide. And so most of the time, if I had to crawl through multiflora rows to get to my survey point, I knew I was going to see some catbirds along the way. Many times it was, I hear catbirds, that means I'm going to have to walk through multiflora rows. So we can definitely use that information to plan ahead. A couple other questions here. So where do non-natives fit into the nesting habitat for these birds? So particularly things like burning bush in Japanese, barberry. Some of the species will use them. Some species are less particular about their nesting habitats. But I didn't look specifically. Again, I think that's the next study that I need to get going at Pennypack is looking more at the nesting use of these different types of shrubs and what's nesting in them. And so some species will use them depending on the habitat, but I don't have any data to present as far as what's using those and how often they're using those. Yeah, and so Edie, there were not a lot of other native shrubs, at least any that were abundant. It's not to say that they weren't there, but when the spice bush was there, the spice bush was there and provided that shrub structure. It was tall. Again, as mentioned before, is probably escaping some of that breeding or the deer browsing, which may allow it to provide that structure for the wood thrush. So it may be that, again, these other native shrubs just were not as abundant because of that deer browse, and that might be some good questions to pursue as well. And my guess is that that David probably has some information about the history of spice bush at Pennypack as far as how that might have played out over time as well. And so looking at those food sources, and again, I think similar to the grassland birds, most bird species are not relying on one plant species to provide, the caterpillars for their food source. And so they use such a wide variety of foods as long as there's some type of larvae. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a caterpillar, but larvae for other insects that they can find and bring back to the young, that becomes the key. And so this is where that diverse habitat comes in, and that potentially some of the non-native species of shrub may be supporting some other types of insects, probably not native butterflies, but maybe some other species. And so again, most birds are using such a wide variety of insects that it's not relying specifically on caterpillars, at least not for the entire breeding season or the time that they're feeding the young. So it definitely could play a role. But again, we could look at some of those other native species, but there's just not very many of them in Pennypack. And so it seems like the wood thrush are doing all right. But this is where a nesting study may be handy to kind of look and see what that nesting success is and how that compares. The vines on the forest edge providing nestings for birds. There probably are some species that will nest in there, but mostly probably mostly your non-natives are the ones that are coming to mind for me. If it's in an area where you might have house sparrows, you might see them in there. But most of the forest species that we have that are of conservation concern are going to be nesting in other types of habitat. That's not really something that they evolved to nest in. The dead trees, on the other hand, could provide habitat for some species, or food for some species. Woodpeckers, European starlings, if we're talking about the edge of a forest, could also be in there. But some of your cavity nesting birds could use those dead trees, the trees that come about, but you'll definitely get higher species diversity from alive trees that are not covered in vines than you will dead trees that are created or killed by vines. There are a couple places, and Kevin would probably know more about this, of deer exclosures that have been there, but mostly, if my memory serves me correctly, mostly the deer exclosures are in places where they're trying to restore the forest. And so you have really young trees that really aren't providing the same type of habitat that the wood thrushes and other species might need. But other studies have definitely, in other places, have looked at deer exclosures and have found that when you exclude deer, you get more native shrubs and a shrub layer. When deer abundances are lower, you get more of a shrub layer for bird habitat as well. So we could potentially look at that kind of exclosure and see how that affects restoration of more native shrubs. But it wasn't anything that I looked at specifically. And so we've kind of covered a lot of this, right? Right. It does seem to provide some of these native shrubs, particularly spicebush in this case, seems to provide some nesting habitat, or at least breeding habitat, whether they're feeding directly on the spicebush or other species that are in the same area. There could be benefits to native shrubs. In the case of the spicebush, there's the spicebush swallowtail maybe. But if we think about other native shrubs, as been mentioned in the questions in the chat, then we could be attracting more native insects and butterflies and maybe other species as well. So thinking about increasing the diversity of native shrubs in a forest could also provide benefits for these, for other bird species and other wildlife species. And so I'll just end with, when thinking about kind of restoration of habitat, it's important to think about goals, because just restoring habitat or saying we're going to restore a grassland or a forest doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get what you expected as far as the end product. And so thinking about what that goal is or what the end product is kind of is a topic that you hear a lot about in restoration ecology. Is what is the goal? Is it to have a native habitat that resembles what was here before? Or is it to have a habitat that provides ecological functions such as habitat, such as erosion prevention? And then based off of that, then depending on what those targets are, what are the restoration goals? What are the target species? Are we targeting for wood thrushes? Do we want to just keep common yellowthroats common and not so much worry about bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks, right? What are those goals? What are the target species? And then use that information to kind of think about what types of vegetation are going to provide those goals. Now, of course, when you start thinking about any use of non-native species, you have to take into consideration invasive species and those kinds of things. That's not what we're talking about here. But generally, we want to use native species whenever possible. But so sometimes in restoration or in programs like the Conservation and Reserve Program in the Midwest, where using these non-native species helps to reach a goal that was part of the restoration. And so just like anything else, right, kind of figuring out what those goals are will help to answer those questions about how we manage a forest or how we restore a habitat. And so I'll end here. Just these are some of the places that I did work for the Grassland, mostly for the Grassland study, and then of course at Pennypack Trust for both the forest and the Grassland study. And then I think I've used up all of my time. I thought I was going to come up short on time, but I think I used it all up. But I'm happy to stick around for questions.
Well, Les, thank you. I mean, I think I've heard a lot of this before, but it's just as refreshing as always. There's a lot of great questions there, and this actually directly relates to a lot of the work we're doing currently at the Pennypack Trust and in surrounding communities. There's talk of adding more grasslands with the local partners and landowners. I can't talk about much more of that, but it does directly relate to everything we're working with right now. And this recording will be very useful to our staff and interns and things like that. But we're very lucky tonight. We have Maria Paula. She is our new research and restoration coordinator. And she's actually handling the direct research behind a lot of our grasslands and things on the trust. So I asked her if I could put her on the spot, and she said yes. So I'd like to just put her on the spot for a second here just to make a couple comments about what she thought about tonight's presentation. Maria Paula?
Hi, yes. Thank you, Les, for this presentation. It was really interesting to hear more about how our vegetation composition relates to bird abundance. We have several projects going on right now with habitat restoration. Like Kevin mentioned, we have some grassland projects where we're trying to work more with some of our neighboring property owners to restore areas that are turf currently, mowed turf, and try to introduce cool and warm season grasses for bird habitat. And that actually relates to one of our questions we just got. We're trying to bring back breeding bobolinks and meadowlarks back with cool season grass. So we're currently applying for grants to be able to carry out those projects over the next 2 years. So it's really exciting. Hopefully we could start seeing these birds back around the trust and breeding. There was a previous question about exclosures. Management exclosure down near Creek Road. We have planted that with native shrubs and native trees. And the idea was to have that understory, and we hope to take advantage of our exclosures and create more of native forb, insect forage, basically, which would be native forbs that pollinators would be going after, but also have grubs, insects that birds would be able to feed on and feed their fledglings to support those populations when they nest. So hopefully those exclosures, in the absence of deer, we can have forbs prosper in there as kind of seed banks, and also areas where we can cultivate more of an insect diversity to sustain those birds. I can take any other questions if anyone has any.
I'll just jump in here about the bobolinks and the meadowlarks. I think one of the big things with the meadowlarks as to why we don't see meadowlarks at the trust is that they need such a large expanse of habitat. And that's just not really there at the trust, just because, I mean, it's naturally a forested area. So these small meadows, even though they're called meadowlarks, they really are more an expansive grassland type bird. So you see them at places like Valley Forge, where there's larger expanses of grassland. So in addition to having kind of taller, denser grasses, which is going to exclude them in some ways, I think it's also a relatively small patch of grassland for meadowlarks to form a population. And to some extent, I think the bobolinks also might fit in there. But the bobolinks also, there's some evidence that they're attracted to areas by other bobolinks. And so if you don't already have breeding bobolinks, it's hard to get them to stay. So people have tried using playbacks and those kinds of things to kind of attract them and get them to stay. But I think also the habitat's just not quite right in many places on the trust as well. So just to kind of bring that up, but they don't stay many places. Even at Valley Forge, I did not find any evidence of breeding bobolinks. So even with all the grassland there, the only place I really found them was at the Stroud Preserve and the area surrounding that. So.
Thank you, Les. I actually got my first meadowlark sitting in my office at the trust. I can't remember when it was, but I couldn't believe my eyes. It landed on a branch right outside my office, which tied me for 7th place on eBird at the trust. So that was exciting. So that's the only meadowlark I've ever seen at the trust, which is incredible. And then there's the yearly visit that we get from the bobolinks, but there's that age-old question: when are they going to nest here? And I'm hoping Maria Paul is going to figure that out. No pressure. No pressure.
Well, hopefully adding nearly 30 acres of grassland will help that. It's really an endangered ecosystem type in our area. So hopefully we'll be able to add to that and see what happens.
Absolutely. It's very, like I said, this presentation is very timely for us. So it's exciting. Unless I'm going to, next week at the Education Committee, I'm going to convince you to help us out with this and make some partnerships. So thanks for that.
Sounds good.
I have one more question here while I'm answering this or asking this last question. If you have other questions, please type them in now. We'll get to those. And then obviously if you have questions later, you can email either I, Lee, or Les, or any of us, and we'll get those questions answered. This is obviously it's Friday night, almost 9 o'clock. We all love talking about this. So we'll answer your questions. This last question from Chris Simmons is it wise to take down Tree of Heaven to make room for native trees? Or is it not worth our energy? Do they provide useful habitat? I have my own answers for this, but Les, I'll let you take a crack at it.
I'll let you take it, Kevin. It's actually not a species that I'm overly familiar with. So if you have an answer, you go for it.
Well, the Tree of Heaven, that's obviously been a target invasive of ours for years, and then more prevalent in recent years because of the emerald, the emerald ash borer. There's so many different things, but the spotted lanternfly, that's it. Thank you. My wife's listening and she got me there. Not the emerald ash borer, that took out the ash trees. The spotted lanternfly is known to lay their eggs and enjoy Tree of Heaven because that's native to Asia, and that's where Tree of Heaven comes from. I believe I'm correct there. So that at the trust, at least, it's been a mission of ours for years to get rid of Tree of Heaven. So it seems like, yes, to us, it's worth our energy, at least. I know it's a tough battle to win because there's so much of it. But then you could argue that every dead tree could be useful habitat for woodpeckers and things like that. So I don't have an exact answer for you, but tree of heaven ultimately is worth getting rid of currently, unless anyone can argue with that. So that's my answer. I don't see any other questions coming here in the chat. So if that's everything tonight, I'll just close out with some information on our next program. Les, unless you have any final words or anything like that.
No, I mean, thanks for having me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Wendy just put a comment in the chat, and Wendy, I think that probably goes back to more farm habitat in the 70s. I really think that really, well, there were some negatives associated with haying. It provided habitat that wasn't there before. So I do think that a lot of those agricultural habitats you saw in the 70s, provided habitat for a lot of grassland birds.
That's very interesting, because that is the trust history. We converted agricultural into grasslands and forests. So that makes sense. All right, last question here, and then I'm going to get into the next one. Just because it's Jennifer Sherwood, I got to ask this one. What habitat do bobwhites like, and is there any hope of bringing them back? Well, I know that the Lord's New Church was that almost 2 years ago, they tried to release bobwhites that they raised, and quite frankly, I don't think they made it through that night. But we haven't seen any since, but that was the common thought. Les?
Yeah, it's when I was in Ohio, at Ohio State, there was people studying them there, and the range just keeps going further and further south everywhere. As far as so the chance of bringing them back anytime soon, I don't think is, and I'm not sure anybody's really figured out what the key is. They seem to be thriving in some places in the south, but not. But even in the northern part of the range in Ohio, where they're still there, they seem to be struggling to maintain populations. So,
Cool. Well, thank you, Les. Truly appreciate you taking the time on a Friday night. Yeah, just thank you for doing that. So on behalf of Wyncote Audubon Society, thank you for coming out tonight. Our next program is on Friday, March 19th at 7:30, and we will be talking about restoring red knots and horseshoe crabs along the Atlantic coast. Dr. Nilesh, I think he's on this call tonight, and he'll be presenting that program. So we're very excited for next month. I put the registration link in the chat, so before you guys forget, click that link right now and register for that program. So like I said, on behalf of Wyncote Audubon Society, thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next month. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
thanks everybody.